Hello everyone, I am Aydoğan Vatandaş, the editor-in-chief of Politurco.com. Today I have a very special guest, author, travel writer, broadcaster, journalist, Mr. Jeremy Seal from United Kingdom. Mr. Seal, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Aydoğan. Nice to speak to you all.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. So I know that you have been covering Turkey for decades. You are a travel writer, but you also wrote a very interesting book titled A Coup in Turkey, A Tale of Democracy, Despotism, and Vengeance in a Divided Land. So how did you have that motivation idea to write a book about a coup in Turkey in 1960?
Let me tell you, I suppose I should row back a little bit to give you a little bit of context and perspective in terms of my connection with Turkey and my own story. I first went to Turkey in 1984 as a teacher of English as a foreign language and fell in love with the country at that time, returned on a regular basis on the years following that, but not as a teacher, rather as a travel writer. Of course, in the 1980s, Turkey was undergoing something of a kind of tourism revolution, and the timing was very good for me in that there was lots to cover, lots of assignments, and it was a wonderful time to discover the country. I did that. I wrote various travel books in the 90s and 2000s, which really took a broad cultural look at the country. Which is to say, to a degree at least, I wasn't as familiar with the politics as I subsequently became. It would be disingenuous to suggest I didn't understand the politics at all, but only later, when I began to get a deeper sense of how the politics worked in Turkey, did I want to turn my hand to writing about politics. And you mentioned the Coup book, A Coup in Turkey, which for me was triggered originally by a realization in 2008 when I was traveling down the Meander River, the Büyük Menderes River. One of the journeys I made for an earlier book was a journey down the Büyük Menderes River, where I came across Adnan Menderes, of course, whose family take their name from the river as a consequence of the diktat in the 1930s that all Turks should have West and South surnames. So I became aware of his story when I passed through the area where he grew up, which is a town called Çakarbayli near Aydın, and then first got a sense that this was a slightly overlooked, and it seemed to me quite important political figure in that he was, of course, the first and only democratically elected Turkish Prime Minister to be hanged, which struck me as pretty striking in and of itself. And I began to wonder whether that untold story, at least in the West, might hold some sort of key for understanding what seems to me the kind of political disarray that Turkey seems to find itself in nowadays. And it was particularly triggered when in 2013 I was on a walk through the backcountry near Milas, again in that part of the world, in the southwest of Turkey. And we walked through a village called Kargacak, where I remember, whose name was Mehmet, inviting us in. I was with a Turkish guide friend, inviting us in for a cup of tea in the typical Turkish hospitality way. And we went in, took the cup of tea, found ourselves in a room in his house, very ramshackle. The walls were plastered with photographs of his family. And amidst these photographs, there was another one which caught my eye, which is a picture of the man I latterly worked out was Menderes, along with two of his ministers and his president at the time, looking at and admiring an architect's model of a mosque. So it struck me, here were a group of political figures, which in itself is interesting in Turkey, because you very rarely see them on the walls where Ataturk kind of controls the political iconography. And moreover, doing something which you wouldn't associate with Ataturk at all, which is looking at and admiring a mosque. And this old man, Mehmet, told me that he was a great admirer of Menderes, and he also said at that time it was terrible what they did to this man and to his colleagues. So that was the moment when I thought, here's a story which I've not heard, and which I'm intrigued by, and I'd love to know more about this story. So that was actually the moment at which I kind of committed to exploring this story and making, if I could, a book of it.
Mhm. And what was your methodology? Did you interview some people in Turkey, or what kind of sources did you have when you were writing the book?
Well, it's a good question. My Turkish is okay, but it's by no means fluent. So I'm fairly limited in terms of being able to go through in-depth Turkish sources, which restricted me, therefore, to limited Turkish sources. Obviously, the newspapers of the time in English and French. I also used a German one. The National Archives at Kew in Britain, and also to a degree in the States as well. But my main source was to actually travel through Turkey, and this was in 2016, talking to as many survivors, if you like, eyewitnesses of the period.
Can you share some of the
Sure I can.
names that you talk to?
Sure I can. I mean, they're all in the book. One example, for example, is an elderly gentleman now whose name is Mehmet Tashdelen, and he was in fact, as a young naval cadet, deputed to act as a guard on Yasa Ada after the coup, when all the Democrat MPs, ministers, and some officials too were incarcerated there, and it was Mehmet Tashdelen's job to act as the sole guide, keeping an eye on Menderes all through his solitary confinement, which began in June 1960 and ran through to the following September. So I spoke to him, and I spoke to various other family members who were close to the Democrats. The daughter of the mayor of Istanbul at the time, whose name is Baysan Baya. So what I was really looking for were not analysts, if you like, but people who could give me a sense of the lived experience of the time, because that was always my intention. As the subtitles of the book suggests, I wanted to tell the tale as accurately as possible, but I wanted to tell what struck me as being an extraordinary human and moving story, rather than a dry political analysis of what took place at the time. And that's what was driving me. And that's why I was looking for people who could give me a sense of the period, give me a sense of the experience from their own perspectives. And by talking to those various people, put together an account as humanly and as dramatically as possible of what happened between 1950, when Menderes came to power, to 1961, September of that year, when having been overthrown, he was finally executed. So I was looking to tell that story of the political story, but also, as I say, the human story.
So can you share us some of the interesting human stories in your book?
Sure. I mean, some of you, particularly your Turkish listeners, will be aware of these. But if you recall, one of the trials in the Yasa Ada trials, the trials of the former Democrats, was called the dog trial. And it was a somewhat surreal trial, whereby President Bayer was accused of having forced the sale of a dog given to him by the King of Afghanistan to Ankara Zoo in return for cash. It was the strangest opening to a trial, which was effectively about violations of the Constitution, and that would lead ultimately to the death of 3 men. And I was very interested in that story, and I ended up talking to one of Bayar's grandchildren, Akile Gusoy, who had memories of the dog and remembered how the dog, which her grandfather had been given on a state visit to Afghanistan, had actually come back and been put up in the presidential palace, to the point where her grandmother said, being a good Muslim, said, "I will not have this dog in the house, and I insist upon you, Jalal Bey, to get rid of this dog," which he did. And actually put it in the hands of his agriculture minister to dispose of the dog. this was one of those kind of surreal stories, which actually ended up reflecting well on Bayer, because it became clear that the money that he'd received for the dog, rather than go into his pocket, had actually gone to the purchase of a new cheshme, a new public fountain in one of the Izmir villages. So there was a sense that there was nothing in this story, but it was so surreal that I just kind of felt it would give an interesting kind of sense of the atmosphere of the time, and the way that this strange, in many ways sinister process was also undercut by moments of almost farce and surrealism.
Did you also interview some people from the secular circles who were believing that Menderes actually deserved such an end? And what was their comment on it?
This was very interesting. Yes, I mean, I remember interviewing a now elderly woman who had been a young teacher at the time, and she told me this extraordinary story about how her family had been persecuted by the Menderes regime, because I think she had been involved in a case whereby she had sent a sarcastic telegram to Menderes when, tiring of the fact that the standard of the cost of living had gone so high, she simply sent him a telegram saying, "Dear Adnan Bey, we'd be very grateful if you would keep down the price of funeral shrouds so that at least we can bury ourselves properly when we die of hunger." And she had this extraordinary response where she and her husband were actually expelled from their schools and sent into exile in a different town. So I was looking for both sides of the story, and there is certainly no sense from my perspective that Menderes was an unflawed man. In many ways, he was increasingly authoritarian and difficult. But my own view was that what I wanted to try and capture was that sense that the two camps, the two political sides, either came to see him and continue to see him as a hero of Turkish traditionalists on the one hand, or as a traitor of Ataturk's secular vision on the other. And I wanted to do something which I felt was fairer by trying to present him as a flawed and complex, but ultimately human character. Because it seems to me that whatever your perspective on Menderes, nobody can disagree that the end that he suffered was anything other than completely unfair and in many ways outrageous, but also counterproductive. Because we all know what happens to people who you unfairly execute or hang. They become martyrs, which is exactly what Menderes has done, which has played in to the hands of the traditionalist conservative wing, and had exactly the opposite effect to the one that I think was intended when the junta, when the Committee of National Unity had him executed along with two of his ministers in 1961.
Interesting. So I understand that you mostly focused on the human side of the story, of the coup. Did you see anything about the international connection of the coup, international aspect of the coup in British archives? Any government involvement in the coup?
Any sense of involvement? No, I was looking for that because I'm very aware that at the time in question, there is no doubt that there was lots of international, specifically American and British involvement in other coups, not least, for example, Mossadegh in
Iran in 1963.
But I looked very hard, certainly from the perspective of the British archives in Kew, and I would say that I found no evidence at all that they were expecting it to happen or they had any interest in it happening. And I've heard this before from many people, the suggestion that the British or the Americans or the Americas were involved. But I don't believe it. And in fact, the more that I looked at the published memoirs of so many of the officers, the junta officers involved in it, none of them suggested that they were put up to it by the British or the Americans. In fact, they suggested that they were trying to keep the fact of their planning from their NATO allies, their American and British NATO allies.
They were trying to prevent it happening.
They were trying to prevent it happening, exactly, if anything at all. So no, I would say there wasn't an international connection, but the moment it happened, certainly the British and probably the Americans, although I'm not so clear about this myself, and lots of other international leading figures were keen to see the executions avoided if at all possible. And as you probably know, towards the end, when the executions looked increasingly unlikely, lots of international statesmen and monarchs and heads of state were attempting to intervene to prevent the executions taking place, unsuccessfully, of course.
And another question is that on the cover of the book, we have Adnan Menderes and Erdogan. So what is the reason of this?
Yeah, let me tell you why that's the reason. Because one of the things that became apparent to me in my researching was the fact that President Erdogan has a long record of having referenced Menderes as, if you like, his political inspiration and his model. That's to say, he's often described him as kind of Turkey's democratic martyr. And it seems to me that there are all sorts of parallels between the two men, possibly in terms of elements of their personality. I think they're both hypersensitive and they don't like being criticized. But when you look at their two political agendas as well, I think they're fairly similar. They're very much looking out for their traditionalist base. Their economic policy seems to be about investing hugely in infrastructure. In Menderes's time, it was water to the villages, it was roads, it was new ports and the like. And in Erdogan's time, it's been bridges and airports and so on and so forth. And in both their cases, of course, lots of money went into the restoration or building of new mosques. So I always felt that there was this kind of strange parallel between the two men. And as I say, one which Erdogan himself has often acknowledged and referenced. And of course, that came to a head when, with the attempted coup on Erdogan in 2016, the difference...
You were in Turkey at that time, right? You were in Turkey.
I wasn't in Turkey at the time. I'd come back. I was in Turkey earlier that year, but I was actually in Britain when the coup took place. But it did seem to me that it was extraordinary the way that these two stories seemed to run in parallel. Both ended with a coup, the main difference being that one was successful and the other one was deeply unsuccessful. And there are all sorts of lessons, I think, to be learned from that. I wouldn't go into the detail of the 2016 coup attempt because it seems that that is still up for grabs. Nobody quite knows yet exactly what was going on. But what is really interesting to me is when you parallel it, when you compare it with the 1960 coup, what a different world we're talking about. The 1960 coup seems to be over in 2 hours, effectively. In those days, very few people had telephones, nobody had televisions, there was no social media, and it was simply a case of taking the airports, the parliament, the post office, a couple of police stations and the presidential palace. There weren't even any bridges that one needed to take. So there was a real sense, it seemed to me, that we're talking about very, very different worlds with very, very different dynamics in play. And that's partly, I think, why the coup failed, the 2016 coup failed, but perhaps not the only reason, because as has been suggested, any number of other things may have been going on at the same time as well.
So my last question, Jeremy, what do you think about the future of Turkey? So I know that maybe you think that you're not experts in Turkish politics, but this is my last question.
Sure.
Do you think, I mean, where do you think this authoritarian tendency of the Erdogan government would end up with?
Here's my prediction, Aydoğan, and that's the best I can do. My feeling is that obviously Erdogan has established a system in which he has an inbuilt electoral advantage, and that's entirely to do with controlling the media. But it seems to me that what he hasn't been able to do is to affect the integrity of the ballot boxes itself, and that seems to have been showed in the mayoral elections in 2019, where there was that attempt in Istanbul to have the results annulled, and there was a second attempt at running the results. And the consequence of that was that the opposition, who had won Istanbul the first time round by not very much, massively increased their advantage second time around. So to me, that was, I took a great deal of optimism out of that, because it seemed to me that that was saying that when the Turkish electorate makes a decision, they're going to insist on it being upheld, which is what happened then. And so I suspect that when the Turkish electorate finally decides that it wants to have a change of leadership and a change of party government, then that is going to happen. And it's possible, it's perfectly possible that it'll happen in 2023. Look, I've heard any number of other Turkish people, Turkish colleagues, suggest to me much more ominous and gloomy outcomes, prospects for that. I don't know. But I just hang on to this kind of hope that when it comes to it, when the Turkish people are ready, they are still in control of their own destiny, and it will be up to them to change government at the ballot box.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Aydoğan, absolute pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I had a very special guest, author, travel writer, broadcaster, journalist, Mr. Jeremy Seal. He is the author of the book, A Coup in Turkey, A Tale of Democracy, Despotism, and the Vengeance in a Divided Land. Thank you so much.